Hello there, and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and today we're talking about nutrient lockup. That's situations when nutrients fall out of solution and become unavailable to your plants, and then because they're unavailable, plants becomes deficient in that nutrient, and then eventually will show symptoms of deficiency. Growth rates will drop, crop quality will drop, and you'll start to cry. So let's prevent that. The easiest way to prevent that is to use gold leaf fertilizer if you're in the US, or liquid gold in the UK, because it contains every essential nutrient for plants in a fully soluble form, and it's pH perfect. So even when you add other additives that might swing the pH or add other nutrients, then you're not going to get lockup. But if you're using a standard hydroponic fertilizer or using your pH swings out of control, then you may get lockup. And we'll talk about, in this episode, all of those different situations and go into more detail about them. So we can split them into two different areas. There's one where there's a chemical interaction and the nutrients interact and they become insoluble. Sometimes it's not even a nutrient. Sometimes it can be an additive, a biostimulant. A great example there is chitosan. We make and sell chitosan as a biofungicide, but if you add it to an iron fertilizer, or you add it even to a seaweed fertilizer, all of the nutrients can come out of solution, especially the iron. Iron wants to come out of solution, and chitosan wants to take it out of solution. So they're a match made in heaven. So you can get iron deficiency. You add that too much of that to your growing conditions, for example. But normally it's fertilizers that are negatively interacting, and they get lockup. Another word for lockup is chemical precipitation. So you may have done experiments in high school or at university where a precipitant is formed, the solid at the bottom of the test tube. And that's exactly what's happened in your fertigation tank or near your roots or in your soil even. It can, and that's insoluble compounds are being formed. So we said they can even occur due to improper mixing, or from water chemistry. The hard water can happen. A very common one is if you're using a PK product and you put it into hard water, you might see that it goes cloudy. And that's because a lot of PK products are based on monopotassium phosphate, which is the cheapest form of potassium phosphate. And that goes cloudy when you add it to hard water. And so if you're using RO water, that's the best option. And that's because calcium and phosphate, when they combine, they form calcium phosphate. So that might be the calcium from hard water. It might be the calcium in an additive. And this is what forms when you add your A. If you were to add an A and a B fertilizer together in the bottle without any dilution, you'd get calcium phosphate forming within a few hours. And even when it's diluted, this can occur in your fertigation tank. So you have to be really careful. And especially if the pH creeps above 6.5, you can get even more formation of this. So you'll get a white sediment in your reservoir tank. It will be a hard white sediment. So never mix concentrated calcium and phosphate together. Always dilute them separately. And never mix your A's and your B's without the water first. And always control the pH, because calcium phosphate is the thing that is in bones. And you think about bones, they survive for thousands of years in the ground without breaking down, because calcium phosphate doesn't dissolve very easily, if at all. It's going to stay as long in the ground as, say, a plastic is. So once it's formed that, your nutrients are never going to come back out of solution no matter what you do to them. Another very common precipitant that occurs with phosphate is iron and phosphate forming iron phosphate, or iron and hydroxide forming iron hydroxide. So iron loves to fall out of solution. And it's probably the most common deficiency you'll see on the likes of Reddit is iron deficiency chlorosis. So that's why all good fertilizers contain chelated iron. So if you see iron sulfate on the list of ingredients, you know that the formulation is a cheap and cheerful one. It might not be cheap to you. You might have bought it for a high price, but it was very cheap for the manufacturer to make. So you want one that is chelated, either with organic acids such as ammonium citrate or with EDTA, DTPA, EDDHA. Basically, if you see 4 or 5 capital letters together, you know that it's chelated. Or you see the words, ammonium citrate. So that will help with prevent the formation of iron phosphate or iron hydroxide. Again, if the pH rises, iron will fall out of solution. So always make sure your pH doesn't rise because you will get cloudy precipitants. And then when the pH rises again, other nutrients will fall out of solution, even if they're not forming things like reacting with the phosphates. So manganese, zinc, and copper, they will fall out of solution and form a precipitant as the pH rises. So you get a lot of micronutrient deficiencies at high pH. That's why we say the ideal pH range is 5.5 to 6.5. Some people may say that it's shorter than that, it's narrower than that, but you don't want to be messing around with pH once it's in that sweet spot. You can get sulfate reactions as well. So calcium will react with sulfate to form calcium sulfate or gypsum. That's really, especially in sulfur-rich additives, if they're combined with high calcium inputs. So say you're using high calcium inputs with a very high sulfur product, a lot of the additives in flowering that improve growth are very high in sulfur. So you put both of those, a CalMag and one of those in, and then you could get calcium sulfate forming, which will dissolve over time. But by the time it's ready to harvest your crop, that's probably not the timeline that they're going to dissolve. We're talking months or years. So if you're growing a perennial crop, you don't need to worry too much about calcium sulfate formation in the long term, but you do if you're growing a crop that's going to be harvested within weeks. You can get potassium and magnesium competition. It's not so much precipitation. They just interfere with each other's uptake. And so that would come under lockout. So it would still be classed as lockout, even though it's not a precipitation. So you can get magnesium deficiencies if you're adding too much potassium. That's often seen in tomatoes and pepper crops where potassium is boosted during fruiting. And as I say, hydroponic fertilizers normally they have loads and loads of potassium. And so that's another reason why CalMags are always useful. You don't need to worry about adding potassium in hydroponics. I've never known potassium to be deficient in any fertilizer or any crop really. Maybe tomatoes if you're not boosting it during fruiting. You get something called yellow collar, I think, if you don't give enough potassium. But most crops, there's loads of potassium just because of the way you get the nutrients in there. Potassium is the additive that gets nitrates and things like this in. So common mistakes is mixing your fertilizers before they're diluted in water. So make sure you add the water first. Never mix an A and a B together. Never mix a PK with a CalMag, for example. That's a disaster waiting to happen. Avoid combining chelated nutrients with strong oxidizing agents like hydrogen peroxide that can destroy the chelate. That's another good tip. And never use unchelated iron. If it contains iron sulfate in the ingredients, it's a very cheap and nasty one. And then you've got your tap water issues. So high bicarbonate or carbonate levels in the hard water can raise the pH, promoting lockout, interfere with nutrient solubility, and reduce buffering capacity. So if you're struggling with hard water, think about using reverse osmosis water or acidify the water source or both. Well, you wouldn't need to use both, would you? You could use a dechlorinator and an acidifier, I suppose, if you didn't have access to reverse osmosis. That would be option. Either reverse osmosis or acidify, then dechlorinate would be my options, because if you've got hard water, it's probably going to have a high chlorine level as well. So monitor your pH, monitor your chlorine levels, your hardness levels. Make sure you stir and agitate your nutrients when you're mixing them. Don't just rely on diffusion. I used to have a university lecturer who said that, we do practicals and he'd shout, too many of you students rely on diffusion for mixing your experiments. If you just add one ingredient to the fertigation tank and it's very still, then if you add your A and then your B, if you've not stirred it, then you could get localized concentrations and you could get precipitation there. So always make sure you mix everything after you've added it to your tank. You could potentially always use, if you're a large scale grower and you're not using gold leaf or liquid gold, as it's known in the UK, then you will need separate A and B tanks. Don't just add them into the same tank. You'll find in the US, a lot of the nursery growers, small scale growers, just use soluble what they call crystal fertilizer. So like a big bag of fertilizer, and then they dump that in, and then they add sulfuric acid later on to pH correct. And they will get lockout, and they also get loads of algae growth in their fertigation tanks. But it's a big issue in those sorts of mom and pop style nurseries that you'll find in Midwest America growing cyclamen and lettuce and things like this. So lockout is a big issue in medium scale growers. If you're using kelp or seaweed extracts, make sure you don't add, then you could get issues with the lockout of anions, things like sulfates potentially. If you're using silica, it will raise the pH and lock out other nutrients. So just be careful with additives that have got an extreme pH or have ingredients that can precipitate other things out. So seaweed's got alginic acid in. So alginic acid will link to calcium, and calcium, you get calcium alginate, which is insoluble. So your seaweed extracts will react with calcium. As I said, your chitosan, that will react with iron. Your silica will react with anything that's acidic, and you'll get like this hard, glassy precipitant forming, which is not cool, and it'll raise the pH. Seaweed extracts can be any pH, so they can be pH 12 or pH 4. So always test the pH of your seaweed extract. That could be the thing that's changing your pH and causing your issue that you didn't know about. You might think of it as being this innocuous natural extract, which it could be, or it could be one of the cheap and cheerful pH 12 products. So always check that if you're having issues. And remember, don't overload. Don't add extra fertilizer. More is not better. It's never better when it comes to fertilizers. You're only going to get issues if you add too much fertilizer. Always add less or the right amount that it says on the label. Some fertilizer manufacturers actually dilute their products because they know that people are going to add too much. One of the very big brands that comes from the Netherlands, for example. Utrema and Gold Leaf US, we don't do that. We state the amount you're supposed to add on the label. If you add more than that, that's your problem. We've told you what is the optimum, and we're going to assume that you're sensible. So, in hydroponics, the clarity of your fertigation solution isn't just visual, it's chemical, and it leads to important issues with your plants. So if you're getting cloudiness, you need to look at what's forming, what could potentially be forming, and is that the reason your crop isn't growing as well as it should be? So keep your solution well balanced, well mixed, and within the pH range. Don't be adding calcium to phosphate, iron to phosphate, and things like this, and you won't get any lockup. Make sure you've got a nice potassium to magnesium ratio. And if you've got any negative interactions or you think I've missed any, then please do get in touch. If you've getting any issues around growth, then I'm more than happy to look into them for you. May not be a definitive answer, but just like when you go to the doctors, I could give you some potential options for what it could be. So that's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Thank you very much for listening. And until tomorrow, goodbye.